for. Okay? Because it varies from tier 1, 2, 3, and depends on geographies, like Ken said. See, the most stringent security policy for the VoIP network I've seen comes from a carrier who's in Europe, who's not in the continent, so that kind of narrows it down. It's about 450 pages. And when they're doing testing, like JT was saying, they have different levels called STCs, safe to connect. There's STC level 1, level 2, level 3, before they connect devices to their VoIP network, and it covers everything. All the best practices, so password links, the secure logging, whatever. So we know a lot of stuff already, as Ken pointed out. Leverage that. That makes, like I said, good practice. And another place to look, if you have a chance, there's a security website, the SANS Institute, for talk to you security guys. I think it's System Administration and Network Security site, and the reading room. Go to the SANS reading room. It's free, and they have all these technical papers covering all the different topics. And one of the ones I would highly recommend, I've seen there on VoIP, on best practices and what they call defense in depth. You don't need all the tools, but you do need the right combination of tools, and the verify, like JP said, during testing. So I'm just going to pick my one question. Anything else, folks? Like I said, we want you guys to...
Just a quick question. I'm curious what you guys feel, where the responsibility falls in the
Well, answer that. You want to go first?
So
Stephane?
Is that the vendor's issue? Is that, where is it best dealt with?
Well, I think it's both. If you're a service provider, you want to only allow devices into your network that are going to pay you, right? So I think it's a right. I mean, it's a birthright. You have to do it, right? You have to be able to charge the guys that are coming into your network. And then customers, need to authenticate their devices because they're going to get charged for it, and there's different ways to do it. And what we see increasing more and more is two-factor authentication, right? So everybody here talks about device authentication. This phone is allowed in, but now what we see more and more is it's really, being extended to the concept of a user. This user is plugged into this device now. So any device can be allowed to access the network. You handle that with TLS and SIP digest, any physical layer connectivity. Then a second factor will come in, secure ID style authentication, and there's a bunch of them out to tell which user is actually sitting at that device. So depending on who you're talking to, which customer you're playing with, both are important. Both have big ramifications increasingly in emergency services and emergency service locations. Right, how you handle things like 911 and how you take those off the table, for these guys, because the wire maps are gone now. You don't know where the copper ended, so you're not rolling a truck to a device anymore as much as rolling a truck to a user. These things really move around. Guys pick up their phones and go home, so it's just different. So authentication is taken on, a whole big, pile of responsibility. In the network.
Any comments?
I just would agree that it's both the endpoint and the service providers responsible for authenticate device, especially, I think fixed mobile convergence definitely play a part in that as well. As you start to transition through different networks or you transition endpoints. Single call, the re-authentication, to make sure that somebody else hasn't hijacked that stream. That's really important.
In fact, depending on where you are in this world, you have service providers who want to control the CPE device, and if that is the case, then they are really willing to keep their copper line active. And we see that, in some parts of Asia and Europe. And, in that situation, the service provider is, really controlling what's going on, end to end. He knows, who the user is, you know, because the copper line is still there and active because there is DSL on it.
One other thing I would say, just seen on the bleeding edge, that where Ken left off. Once again, technologies that are established in the data world, we're going to see going forward. Three of them. First off, the concept of network admission control, where in fact that you make sure a system is clean, you know, up to whatever patch level before you let it in the network. And since these things are basically computers now, so there are some people who have with network admission control. And two things are kind of going at the hip. The next step around authentication is the concept of single sign-on, where in fact, like the data network world, they do this already, where you sign on once and you're able to go wherever you need to go within a certain level of authentication. Tied to that concept was referred to as federated identity, or like a passport. Because I mean, like the VPN, you're transversing, you're going to ASPs, you're going to access network, you're crossing all sorts of boundaries. So if you had the equivalent of a passport that all the countries agreed to, which is the concept of federated identity. So that's a little longer term, but that's something that's established in the data world. And since we are in the data world with our handsets, you'll see that, you know, longer term. But yeah, the two-factor stuff today for sure, and then things like single sign-on and federated identity going forward into like 2009 and 2010. Sorry, you had a question?
Yeah, question is, how do you recommend the relation of responsibility of security among the firewall and the SBC? There's overlapping, not overlapping, there's something. Seems like they are in the same category. Secondly, from like a service provider perspective, like security people traditionally are the firewall. But now we're talking about this more security and organization-wise, it might have changes or something, right? Because of like
Yeah, throw your firewalls out. So a lot of the firewalls just aren't architected today to handle voice and SIP sessions and the applications that are running underneath them. They're just not. I mean, those guys, you know, believe they will eventually get there, and maybe they will eventually get there. And there was a talk this morning about, you know, putting voice in SBC in a router and everything else. I mean, the state of the art today is, you know, an SBC, a SIP session management thing is its own box, right? So, you know, as of today, you know, I would not run any of this stuff through a firewall. It just doesn't have the level of security you need. And usually the number one thing that you get is it stops the service from working, right? I mean, the service is still too new. You know, we're still in the beginning of, you know, the rollout of all this, and we were talking today at lunch about SIP packets in headers and what has to go through and what has to change and what a B2B means. And, you know, the number one request I get from my partners is, you know, changing what this header means on the back end of a B2B because somebody added some application that needs this header, you know, from a registration to pop through, or, you know, some, you know, silly thing. I mean, the standard is not a, you know, true ubiquitous standard for deploying all applications yet. And firewalls just stop that from working, right? I think if you put a, you know, checkpoint firewall or anything other than a very simple home firewall out there, you're in trouble. So, you know, I don't think any of that stuff belongs coming through a firewall. I mean, you keep it up for your data sessions, you run your voice and SIP application stuff, you know, through an SBC that's architected today to handle those pieces.
Yeah, so from the service provider perspective, we recognize that. Took a couple of steps. First step we took was the network security guys responsible for not our internal enterprise network, but the guys responsible for our service network. Report up through the engineering and operations chain of command. So we're all in the same organization. We also made them part of our development process. So when we roll out a new network element, or we do major revisions of code, part of the process is to run that through the security team. They actually go out and do testing. There's a